Okay, so welcome and to Make It Conscious. In this episode, I was thinking to talk about Jung's concept of the ego. So in the last few episodes, we've been looking at another Jungian concept, the transcendent function, and you guys seem to enjoy that and appreciate the scholarly approach. So I thought I'd continue in a similar vein here, talking about this very key fundamental subject, the ego, and look at exactly what Jung said about it. I think there's a lot of value in going back to the original texts of some of these great thinkers and saying, what did they actually say about it? There's many, not just misunderstandings, but there's many different uses of the word. When I say ego, what comes to mind? You might think of, in the common sense of the word, ego might be someone who is rather full of themselves, thinks very highly of themselves. But there's an implicit sort of negative connotation there, because there's nothing wrong with recognizing one's own abilities as impartially as one can, but that's very different from conceit or egocentrism. And there's a lot of nuance to these psychological subjects that I think it's time we really started to pick them apart and get very, very clear on them. Now, thankfully, we have a lot of great insight and philosophy and psychology to draw on from many of the thinkers that have passed. And Jung's work, of course, was a great cornerstone in modern psychology. There's many, many great thinkers that we could talk about, that I like to talk about, that I discuss in the courses that I'm releasing, like the Make It Conscious Philosophy course, for example. And certainly Jung, as much as people rather ironically tend to idolize Jung, yeah, he was prolific. He had a great deal to say. He contributed a tremendous amount to the subject of psychology, but he wasn't the only thinker. And in the 63 years or so since he died, there has been a lot of deviation of his thought in just such a short space of time. So that gives you some sense of how quickly these ideas can change. All that said, let's talk about the ego, because it's such a pivotal concept in his whole psychology and for understanding the mind in general. But I want to focus today on specifically a piece of writing in Jung's work, Aion. This is part of Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2, and it's a long essay, essentially, into the phenomenology of the self. He means the self as in the archetype of the self or the totality of the psyche. So within that, he actually describes very succinctly concepts like the ego, the shadow, the anima and the animus, and several more. So just to set the scene here is a foreword, or at least a very small snippet of it, that Jung wrote in May 1950. So he's building a long career of work already. And in this writing, he says his aim is to, or the theme of his work is the idea of the Aion. That is the Christian Aion. So he goes on, my investigation seeks to throw light on the change of psychic situation within the Christian Aion. So this 2,000-year period, which is actually an astrological period, the age of Pisces, referring to the constellation that the sun appears in on the vernal equinox. So coming to the end of that era now, regardless of your attitude to astrology, this is nonetheless conceptually a period of great significance, and being that we're going to enter the next one, the age of Aquarius, and Pisces, of course, being symbolized by the two fishes and associated with Christianity, not least Jesus Christ. And that also implying a kind of duality, the two fishes, one being the light child, the other one being the dark child. One is deemed to be good, the other one's deemed to be so-called bad, but there's a kind of a curious twist in that actually good stretched to infinity becomes bad, and bad stretched to infinity destroys itself. So our judgments of these things, as good and bad, have to have a nuanced meaning. And so Jung's thesis is that, well, the next age is really about the constellation of the need to reconcile the opposites, the need to find the truth that underpins both. So that's the context of this. He says, again, I write as a physician with a physician's sense of responsibility and not as a proselyte. This is a theme that I keep coming back to because Jung did not advertise himself as a philosopher. I think you can barely say that he was a philosopher to all intents, but it wasn't really his aim. He wasn't looking to explain reality, whether in terms of how it works or why it is the way it is. He was explaining a psychology it was a model of mind, and in particular, a model of therapy, a system for a therapeutic process. Even though in his writing itself, I wouldn't say he was particularly systematic, as in he didn't draw any complex graphs or image like maps of the psyche or anything like this. It tends to be other thinkers that have done that subsequently. He was prolific in his writing. His collective works is around 11,000 pages, and that's not even all of his work, not by any stretch. So the sheer volume of his written work out there is massive, and it's all fascinating to read. It's all quite an intense read. It's all a very incisive and, I dare say, profound read. But it's not uncommon, as I mentioned, for, understandably so, for people to project such things onto Jung. Completely natural to do so, because he did embody many archetypes quite effectively. But I think he makes it clear, to be fair to Jung, that his goal was not to extract your inner content and get you to place it onto him for his benefit and at your expense. That was completely the opposite of what Jung was setting out to achieve. But at the same time, the emphasis on individuality and the understanding that if you are doing that, it's a product of your own mind, and there's maybe some value in it long term. There's a need to realize oneself through the world, understanding what we experience in the world is actually a part of us that's maybe nascent and trying to come out. My point was that Jung is not encouraging that per se, but neither is he saying, oh, you shouldn't be doing that, that's a bad thing, you should be doing this instead. Do you see the irony in that? Because if he was doing that, then he would have actually been inadvertently perhaps marking himself as a sage after all. Oh no, you shouldn't be projecting onto me, and I'm the one who should be telling you that you shouldn't be doing it. See what I mean? So none of that. The emphasis is always back onto the individual through whatever tomfoolery you get stuck up in and whatever consequences are brought about by that. Ultimately, it's you that has to bear that and reap the results and learn the lessons. That's what we do. That's what the mind does. Nothing wrong with it. Just to make that point here, this is very much from his perspective as a physician and as a psychologist, I might add. So let's move on to the actual writing here. So it's a very short chapter. It's just called The Ego. It's 4 or 5 pages long, very concise. And this certainly isn't all of what Jung wrote about the ego, but it's a very nice summary written in the latter part of his life. So I think it's a pretty good place to focus this episode here. So he says, we understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness. And insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness. For no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. So put very simply then, well, the ego is on one hand a concept, but it's also an experience, and it's the I. And actually, a lot of the original writing of Jung and others was, of course, in German. And the word used in German was ich, or the ich, the I, which has been translated into ego. Now, this has caused many confusions over the decades, so we need not conflate it with ego in that common sense I refer to as having a big ego. Although the two subjects are related, and I'd like to talk about that a bit later, but for now, just know that it is this sense of I, and that's necessary precisely because, as he says here, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. So how could anything be known if it wasn't known in relation to something else? That's it. That's the ego. That's what this is all about. So again, Jung, not being a philosopher by trade, wasn't trying to explain exactly how this is happening metaphysically or why this is happening metaphysically. He can certainly explain it in terms of the process of individuation, which you could argue is really just what the universe is doing. It's just that's what we call it when it's on an individual scale. But essentially, it's the same process. It's this, the whole arc follows this sequence of the splitting off of the I and the not I, and then creating a polarity out of that duality created by the mind, And that's how the I is known. But it then transpires that because of that act of mind, that's not actually the whole I. So there's kind of two elements to this. What do you really want to call them? Two factors. One being the I we know as the ego, the sense of I, but the other one being the self and the totality of the psyche. So in order for the I to form, it must actually leave some things out, but then it has to re-engage with them. So shadow work is, of course, a key part of that. Shadow work is really in a similar way, like a sub-component of a much larger reconciliation. Shadow work has there's no agreed upon definition, but it tends to imply that this is purely on that engagement with the opposite of the personality that's been left behind. Like a lot of these terms, the shadow is also used somewhat in quite an inconsistent way sometimes. So I want to make more content on that and be really precise about what it is we really mean about that as well. But for now, just know that this ego is the subject. And without that, you couldn't know anything. Unless you form an I, there's nothing to be known in the first place. And then you could never, ever know the self, because the self would just be an undifferentiated mass. So this ego, again, the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. Because as he says, no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. So let's just cover off then this difference between the Jungian ego and the more commonly used meaning of the word ego. So if we talk about someone having an ego, or like having a big ego, it tends to imply that maybe they're quite full of themselves, quite conceited, and that has a negative connotation. Why might that be negative? Well, because there's a difference between recognizing your value and not recognizing your value. That's one delineation. But a second one might be, well, there's recognizing your value objectively, impartially, and honestly in a healthy way. And there's another kind of recognizing your value, which is that not only do I recognize my value, but that I'm going to use that as a way to assert myself on the world at the expense of others. In other words, serving power. So this is an alienated self that is insisting upon itself. And it's doing that as a reaction to the unknown and what it deems to be undesirable, but also because there's uncertainty in that. So there's a kind of satisfaction that comes from the security in that sense of self. This is an unhealthy form of self, but that satisfaction can be moderated and understood in the context of the wider field of the unknown, both out there in the world and inside one's own mind. But also it can be used in an unwholesome way where the ego just wants to maintain that self-image isolated in itself without any regard to anything outside of it. So it then starts to see the world as mere tools, ways of upholding the existing self-image, because it doesn't want to change. It doesn't want to change because there's great expanses of mind to be crossed. There's tension, there's opposites, there's the unconscious, there's unresolved feeling. In another place, Jung actually says that pride is generally a compensation for fear. So that isn't his exact words, but I'll have to find that at some point. But in other words, the pridefulness of what we might call a big ego is actually a reaction to the fear of the unknown. So with that all said, you can see how these two uses of the word ego are related, but they're very much not the same. One is simply the subject that must exist in order for anything to be known. The other is a subject that has become inflated or obsessed with itself, and to use a Hegelian term, alienated, but is also doing that as a way to resist its own transformation. So even though we might explain that as a big ego, it's not actually the most accurate way to describe it, because the size of it is actually a compensation for what is essentially a feeling of a sense of being small, of not encountering the world, not knowing the world, not having transformed through experience. So it's probably enough said on that for now. But another thing that's often discussed in Jungian psychology is the need for a strong ego. So again, what does that mean? Because a strong ego in the Jungian sense is very different from a big ego in the common sense. A strong ego is essentially an ego that is willing and able to endure tension or suffering, because it's through that very tension being held and experienced in consciousness that a reconciliation is achieved. This is a large part of what we were looking at in the previous 3 episodes on the transcendent function. This tension of opposites. It's not about merely understanding it. It's not actually merely only about feeling it. It's about this union of opposites from which a third can emerge. A third that simply was not possible to even imagine before there was this blending of the previous 2 opposites. In order for there to be any opposite, in order for there to be any onward movement towards greater complexity and greater self-knowledge, there has to be an ego. There has to be something that establishes itself first as the I, because it's the only way that it can then relate itself to anything and transmute. But that hostile stance to the world is understandable and occurs because there's just either too much to deal with at any one time, or it's an attitudinal problem where the ego has either not learned or has decided that it just needs to persist in its current imagined form of itself, its own current self-image. In other words, it's resisting transformation. It doesn't have empathy with the world around it, probably because it's decided to actually drop empathy because it discovers that whenever it encounters the world, it just feels pain. So the most obvious thing to do there is to just shut out the world. Now, for some duration of our lives, especially early in life, mere pleasure and pain serve as somewhat useful proxies for growth and development. When you're a baby, if you're hungry, that experience is painful or at least unpleasant, and it's a pretty good idea to then eat some food as a baby. It is really important. As an adult, we still need food, but if you go a day without eating, big deal. Like, it's not going to really do you any long-term harm in most situations. For a baby, it's going to do a lot more harm. And that's just one example. There's countless examples. But in that very, very early stage of differentiation, that quite rudimentary seeking of pleasure and avoidance of pain is quite conducive to those first steps, that separation. Now, that doesn't only apply to babies, of course, but it's a very gradual process where as we develop, we're able to more accurately understand what actually is and isn't conducive for us. But consciously, we all have different goals. I tend to think that the theory that seems to fit all the facts is that the ultimate goal is self-knowledge on every scale. And to do that, there is this increasing complexity that we experience in ourselves and in the world around us. So to that end, we become more discerning as to what actually is going to help with that process and what isn't. So Jung goes on, theoretically, no limits can be set to the field of consciousness, since it is capable of indefinite extension. Empirically, however, it always finds its limits when it comes up against the unknown. This consists of everything we do not know, which therefore is not related to the ego as the center of the field of consciousness. The unknown, everything we don't know, but that also includes the internal unknown, that's the unconscious, and the external unknown, that's the outer world. So the ego finds its limit when it comes up against this unknown. But even though we might know something, we know something in our friends, in our family, in other people, in objects. We know them, but we know that they're not us as well. But at the same time, this relates sort of to the Eastern idea of attachment. If we become very, very attached to something, there's nothing wrong with, of course, having an interaction, an attachment in the sense of empathy. But there's a problem in attachment in the sense of ego identification and ownership. So if we need to place our own energy, let's say, into exterior objects and other people and beings, then that's a case of undifferentiation. So that's sort of a synthesis between Jungian psychology and Eastern spirituality, Buddhism and Hinduism and so on. That sort of explains it. It points to areas where we have not individuated from the world around us. Now, this doesn't protect one from natural instances of harm or from natural, rightful experiences of pain and discomfort, whether emotional or physical. It's just to say that it's that attachment, that psychic attachment, that points to areas of the self that are erroneously being placed outside. So it's those experiences that show us where we haven't fully individuated. As Jung says, the unknown falls into 2 groups of objects. those which are outside and can be experienced by the senses, and those which are inside and are experienced immediately. The first group comprises the unknown in the outer world. The second, the unknown in the inner world. We call this territory the unconscious. Right. So moving on, despite the unlimited extent of its bases, the ego is never more and never less than consciousness as a whole. So in some places, the ego is described as the central points of conscious attention. So it's both the subject and the central point of consciousness. In other places, Jung talks about how the feeling of freedom, the feeling of free will, accompanies this experience of consciousness. That's the extent of the ego. It's where we have agency. The ego is not more than what we're conscious of, neither is it less than what we're conscious of. Of course, there are situations where these two things do not seem to align. There can be consciousness outside of the ego. Experiences might be called ego dissolution. These aren't generally a pervading experience that exists at all times. Some would regard that as quite an exalted situation, but one could equally say, but then how would you navigate this whole process and journey? So there's definitely value in such experiences. But again, let's not conflate the two meanings of the word ego. The ego as the subject and the more negative common use of ego, implying a kind of inflation, are two very different things. So Jung goes on, the ego could, theoretically at least, be described completely, but this would never amount to more than a picture of the conscious personality. All those features which are unknown or unconscious to the subject would be missing. A total description of the personality is, even in theory, absolutely impossible, because the unconscious portion of it cannot be grasped cognitively. This cuts to the heart of some really important philosophical territory, and a lot of what I like to cover on this channel. And I've illustrated it here in an image of a guy looking at his phone and presumably looking at photographs of himself because he's surrounded by images of himself. So the way I describe it is a bit like this. A photograph of you is not really you. Well, it is you though, isn't it? Of course, it's on one level you could say, yeah, of course that's you. It's a photograph of you. How could it not be? But on another level, can you see how it's anything but you? It's a piece of paper with an image on it. And that's a pretty useful analogy for the self-image versus the self. Now, there's nothing wrong with the self-image, but it, by the same token as having utility and use and serving a purpose, it also has a negative side. It would be impossible if it didn't. Everything in this universe we find ourselves in has to have duality. It's a fundamental prerequisite of existence as we know it. So for that very reason, any description of the personality of anything is not the thing. It cannot be. It cannot even fully capture it. This is the nature of language. Words themselves are a bit like this. They're signs that point to something, and they necessarily leave something out. And Jung describes it here as though because the unconscious portion of it cannot be grasped cognitively. Yeah, that's another way of thinking about it. He seems to be talking more about the sort of, so thoughts about the self and not the self, thoughts about the shadow and not the shadow. To truly know these things, they have to be experienced through that union of opposites that I keep coming back to. They have to be felt, they have to be thought about. It's no coincidence that the Christian cross has 4 lines coming out of it. So, this idea of a picture of ourselves, an image of ourselves, or I like the word snapshot of ourselves, it's not only not a full description, it's an absolutely impoverished description of what we is, really. But it's also a very necessary one for knowing the self. Each time we go out to postulate ourselves in some way, whether it's our whole being over the arc of our lives, like this going out, becoming a productive, law-abiding citizen, and then having to confront the shadow, whether it's even on a more micro scale of just going out for a walk and, you know, buying a chocolate bar. That's a bit of an inane example, but every kind of action has a thesis and a negation and an antithesis and a reconciliation. So it happens on all scales. And we have to do this in order to actually reconcile with that shadow material or that antithesis, whatever it might be. It's through that wisdom is arrived at. So then, Jung goes on, clearly then, the personality as a total phenomenon does not coincide with the ego, that is, the conscious personality, but forms an entity that has to be distinguished from the ego. Naturally, the need to do this is incumbent only on a psychology that reckons with the facts of the unconscious. But for such a psychology, the distinction is of paramount importance. So as I said right at the start, the ego is contingent on the existence of something other, this unknown, and within our own minds, this is what we call the unconscious, which in Jung psychology divides, of course, into the personal and the collective unconscious. But the two concepts basically imply each other. And also overarching all of that is the self. So the ego is not the self. The ego is the subject which then experiences the unknown, confronts the world. Right, this is why we have the hero myth. The hero is one who goes out and, at least in the first half, conquers the forces of the unknown, essentially. The hero is someone who can confront the unknown and do so confidently. What's that about? How can you confidently confront the unknown? Because if it's not known, then it's an unquantifiable factor at risk. So there's something heroic about that. There's also something foolish about that. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that in the sense of the symbol of the fool. He's very light on his feet. He's just going about life. He's about to fall off a cliff, but he neither knows nor cares, it would seem. It's not like he isn't aware of the fact that there are some risks, but those risks are unknown. In business, they sometimes talk about the unknown unknowns. What can you do about those? Well, all you can do about them is go forth and allow them to appear and have a kind of faith and confidence that whatever happens, you come away with self-knowledge in the end. It's one of the few things you can't lose at. Whether your current self-image is bolstered, modified, or broken apart for later reconciliation with the opposite, either way, it's a kind of progress. But of course, the unconscious mind is playing a huge, huge role in all of this. And much of our very own personality is unconscious. So the whole of the personal unconscious is part of the self. It's just, it cannot be all wholly made conscious at once, because there wouldn't be that initial bifurcation or into self and other. So the ego, and not least the self-image, are not the full personality. And it may be somewhat useful for a time to regard them as the same. This isn't something we choose to do. This is just how things unfold naturally, because this is one of the earlier impressions we experience. It's a kind of primary thesis that we go out into the world believing that we are our ideas about ourselves or our persona, the way we dress up the ego to the external world. But as time goes on, the more we encounter negation and antithesis and shadow in our experience, that belief just gets picked apart piece by piece, sometimes shattered completely. It has to be rebuilt into something more comprehensive and more truthful. So Jung goes on, I have suggested calling the total personality, which though present cannot be fully known, the self. The ego is by definition subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part to the whole. Inside the field of consciousness, it has, as we say, free will. By this I do not mean anything philosophical, only the well-known psychological fact of free choice, rather than the subjective feeling of freedom. But just as our free will clashes with necessity in the outside world, so also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. And just as circumstances or outside events happen to us and limit our freedom, so the self acts upon the ego like an objective occurrence, which free will can do very little to alter. So even though Jung says he doesn't mean anything philosophical about this, I don't think you can't be philosophical when you're talking about the very workings of mind itself. So in summary then, first key point Jung is making here is simply that the ego is subordinate to the self, which is what I was really just discussing. even though for some time it may well feel like the ego is the center of the personality, there's every reason for it to feel that way. That is a stance that has to gradually or suddenly be questioned and dismantled, such that the ego then plays a very important role, but it understands that it's not the center of the psyche. Okay, now, next point. When he talks about the psychological fact of free will and the subjective feeling of freedom, this is interesting and sort of relates actually to some of the points made in the transcendent function, which we discussed in the last 3 episodes. Because think about it, this postulation by the psyche, this thesis, whether it's a thesis of ourselves or a belief system or a desire for something or any kind of judgments, say, this thing good, other thing bad, chocolate good, vanilla bad, whatever it is, there could be any number of reasons why such judgments are made. And often we don't actually truly know why we've made such judgments, let alone why we go about the kind of life that we choose, why we choose certain jobs, why we choose certain relationships, what unconscious forces are actually being activated there or trying to come to the surface. However, in all of those things, it's not like we just walk around like an automaton, like just feeling like we're being possessed and controlled by some unknown force. No, because you see, what's going on is the ego kind of has to make out that its conscious experience is completely congruent and makes sense. So I sometimes think of it like, even though the ego might be probably or considerably less than 50% of the data that are influencing the mind at any one time, it tends to extrapolate that to 100%. And the reason I said 50% is because if we're just thinking in terms of this polarity, the yin and yang, or the two fishes of Christianity, one thing that can be observed quite often in our world is that we take one side of something which contains a great deal of truth and a great deal of value, and we can put that forward as though it's the truth. It solved our problem, or at least our most recent iteration of a problem, and therefore it seems like the answer. But in reality, it's actually 50% of the whole being postulated as 100%, right? So, eliminate craving and you'll reduce suffering, or you'll eliminate suffering. What does that even mean? For starters, what does craving actually mean? And why is suffering undesirable? Is there not actually some truth or value in the need to hold on sometimes and the need to endure tension? Okay, so let's just take that to an extreme. And you might find that, I've developed all kinds of skills and I've got really, really advanced in a material sense, perhaps, but it sets up this massive shadow that then also has to be reconciled with. So whichever side of that equation we're sat on, there's both pros and cons to it. And the journey of self-knowledge is in reconciling those two. That's the journey to wholeness. But as part of that, there has to be this going out and this coming back. But it's not accurate to say that, all you ever have to do is go out. Just go out, just go out, just go out and just achieve everything. Just make the world in your image and just make things a certain way. Then you won't ever have to worry about dealing with your inner world and all that awkward stuff. No, I don't want to go there. But at exactly the same time, if you then said, actually, no, all you got to do is just let go and meditate in a cave forever, all your problems will be solved. So it's not hard to see how we need both of these in some degree. But it's not even a question of degree necessarily. It's actually a question of a synthesis of the two. It's not about mere balance or compromise. In the end, it has to be, what is this alchemical product of the two, this third thing that didn't exist before? That is self-knowledge. That is the realization of the self. So in any situation where we're postulating a thesis, what tends to happen is we then extrapolate that into the unknown and start to see the world in terms of it. This happens with any theory, any philosophy, any model. An example is, say, personality psychology itself. It has great value. It has some relationship to truth. But if we fall in love with the model, we start explaining unknown phenomena in terms of the thing. And then what's happening is we're actually leading with the model, not with experience. We're actually then denying the unknown factors and inadvertently avoiding an opportunity to actually reconcile with some new material. So it's both a vehicle and a trap, just like everything else. And this feeling of free choice tends to, in much the same way, accompany choices that actually had quite a significant unconscious component. And so they should, because that's the material that is trying to come to the surface. So the last point he makes here about events seeming to happen to us, this is very much related to Hegel's idea of negation. So free will has necessity as its negation, or as limitation as its negation. Because if you take what appears like free will to its extreme, that's just like heedless gallivanting, then it necessarily sets up limitation. Because if you're then just jumping from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, following your whims, well, you have a great hangover the next day, basically. So there's like early warning signs to that kind of approach, but then there's also physical limitation where the body simply doesn't allow you to continue in the way that you did before. This is the beginning of necessity. And the way you sublate that is by taking responsibility for it. It's by reconciling the two. You have to start thinking, okay, well, I have free will. I can literally go out right now and do anything. I can attempt to steal a car or something, but there'll be, by necessity, there'll be an almighty shadow to that choice. So hopefully most people watching this wouldn't even consider doing something like that. But this is just a kind of extreme example of how just purely serving the alienated self, the ego, results in limitation, which must then be reconciled with. And ultimately that calls on empathy and the willingness to engage in a mutual transformation with the world around us. And if we honor freedom, then we have to honor freedom in other people as well. True freedom comes from everyone having it. If only one person had it, then that's not freedom, that's self-contradictory. Because how can I truly value freedom if I'm also denying other people's freedom? That's very, very, I was going to say quickly, it's not necessarily going to quickly fall down, but in the grand scheme of things, it won't take very long. And just as outside events appear to happen to us and limit our freedom, so the self does so internally. Wherever our consciousness becomes one-sided, it leaves something out, it therefore becomes self-contradictory, and it is as though the self then has to force itself into our conscious experience. Because take any thesis to its extreme, and it becomes its opposite, just as Hegel said. If I just want to be infinitely free, I will make myself unfree. If I want to be infinitely logical, I will be completely illogical. If I want to be infinitely kind, I'll become a monster. So this is precisely how the self must therefore act upon the ego like an objective occurrence, which our own so-called freedom or free will can do very little about. So Jung goes on, the ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation, so far as these are achieved by the will. The ego therefore has a significant part to play in the psychic economy. Its position there is so important that there are good grounds for the prejudice that the ego is the center of the personality, and that the field of consciousness is the psyche per se. So I've pretty much discussed that already. So just to reiterate that it's perfectly understandable that the ego might be taken as the center of the personality, at least for some time. And maybe it's even actually necessary for a while so that it can properly postulate itself in the world as a self in relation to the other. But then, of course, that creates the negation, the antithesis, and the shadow, which must be reckoned with. He goes on, if we discount certain suggestive ideas in Leibniz, Kant, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, and the philosophical excursions of Carus and von Hartmann, it is only since the end of the 19th century that modern psychology, with its inductive methods, has discovered the foundations of consciousness and proved empirically the existence of a psyche outside consciousness. With this discovery, the position of the ego, till then absolute, became relativized. That is to say, though it retains its quality as the center of the field of consciousness, it is questionable whether it is the center of the personality. It is part of the personality, but not the whole of it. So Jung and not even Freud were by any means the first to talk about or even allude to an unconscious mind, but it was them and their colleagues that empirically proved it in the realm of psychology. And that therefore means there is this psyche outside of consciousness. In fact, the conscious ego sits on top of this unconscious field, both the personal and the collective. So it's simply not tenable that the ego ought to be considered the center of this material. It's a very key part, but it is not what there is. And I've said in other places that I think the very notion of spirituality or the process of developing self-knowledge can be construed as aligning oneself to what there is beyond the ego. Now, of course, the ego holds a great deal of truth, and it's not wrong in its postulations. It's just that it's an image of truth, just like a photograph of you is an image of you. It contains truth, but it's not always necessarily even in a literal sense. Sometimes it is, but it's what that all implies and maybe even what it means symbolically. So that then has to be taken forward and combined and transformed alongside what is left out. So the ego is not to be denied, it's not to be put down or ignored or escaped from. It's actually a vital part of this whole process. But at some point it must be understood, because there is this engagement with the unconscious that has to occur, that there's so much going on behind the scenes that the ego is actually just part of that, and it plays the role of actually engaging with that material. So it's a question of integrating with the unconscious content, but remembering the unconscious is vast. The personal unconscious is vast, let alone the collective unconscious and the archetypes that belong to it. You're not going to integrate the collective unconscious, not in its entirety, but you can deepen a relationship with it. And in fact, it is the ego's attitude to the unconscious mind which in large part actually renders it. So if the ego is so alienated and determined to maintain itself, deeming its view of itself and its approach to life as the right one, as the good one, or its belief system as somehow literally absolutely true, the more it clings to that, the more the unconscious will push back harder. It has to. It's an energetic necessity. And by the same token, if there's a kind of attitudinal problem, a judgment of the unconscious itself as bad or evil or negative, then in just the same way, it has to then take on that quality of negativity, that quality of evil and antagonism. In this point, it's not merely different or opposite in terms of a qualitative sense, but it also takes on a whole new direction where it's actually attempting to violate your very freedom. Precisely because at that point, one would be having to establish themselves in a way that violates other people's freedom and believing that they have every right to do so, but that actually it's only the world that's evil, right? It's the world that's violating freedom, not me. But by pushing your own thesis so hard, beyond a point that can only be done at the expense of others, because this is that limitation I just discussed. It's the denial of limitation. It's the lack of respect for the necessity of that. So on one hand, yes, there's an integration that has to occur. It's crucial. But on the other hand, there's also the deepening relationship to the unconscious itself and upgrading our understanding of it and our appreciation of mystery. Okay. Jung goes on, it is simply impossible to estimate how large or how small its share is, the ego's share, how free or how dependent it is on the qualities of this extra-conscious psyche. We can only say that its freedom is limited and its dependence proved in ways that are often decisive. I mean, there's no way we can measure the unconscious or even the ego and say, this is how big the ego is, this is how big the unconscious is. And so Jung's advice here is that, he says, in my experience, one would do well not to underestimate its dependence on the unconscious. He later says, some criterion for the right measure is afforded by the psychic consequences of a wrong estimate. This is it. This is unavoidable. You'll feel this in tension. You will see this in unfavorable outcomes. You experience it in emotions. It will show up in a symbolic form. And a lot of this is down to two things, responsibility and intention. If you are willing to take responsibility for your mind, it's not a question of blaming yourself or believing that you cause everything, because quite clearly you don't. However, when it arises, you can do something about it. And it's through that responsibility, like I said, that we sublate limitation and freedom. We have freedom, we have that free will, we can go out, we can make a choice. We then come up against limitation by necessity, because any more than one free choice being made and they're not wholly compatible with each other. Maybe I want to go to the Maldives on one hand, but on the other hand, I want to stay here and produce work and make videos. Right? So clearly freedom doesn't allow us to do both of those things at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. So every choice sets up limitation. It means the sacrifice of something else. So freedom contains limitation. Limitation is contained within freedom. And how do we reconcile that? It's through responsibility. Responsibility is the way in which we deal with necessary limitation. And the second thing is intention. That's intention to loosen our grip on things, but at the same time, it's not to push them away too hard. So it's walking that line between Eros and Thanatos. But it's also just opening up to the signs, the unconscious. It requires a degree of concentration, the willingness to recognize what's actually going on, give our attention to the things that are most relevant to that. Because the directedness of mind creates this censorship or ignorance of what is deemed irrelevant. But sometimes we just have to open that up a little bit, just make a conscious decision, just going to pay a bit more attention. Notice symbols as they appear. Look out for synchronistic experiences. There's always value in these things. Look for the meaning in everyday occurrences. And these can give you some very valuable clues. They are the way, frankly. So yeah, what is right? What is aligned to yourself? What isn't? Well, the good news is that if you pursue what isn't aligned with yourself hard enough, you will know about it sooner or later. Just a question of being sensitive to that and being willing to listen to the outcome of what you're doing. Okay, next one. From the standpoint of the psychology of the personality, a twofold division ensues: an extra-conscious psyche, whose contents are personal, and an extra-conscious psyche, whose contents are impersonal and collective. The first group comprises contents which are integral components of the individual personality, and could therefore just as well be conscious. The second group forms, as it were, an omnipresent, unchanging, and everywhere identical quality or substrate of the psyche per se. So I've actually already touched on this, but this is, of course, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The first one relating purely to your own individual life, except that it's also, of course, formed through your relationships with the world, and it's a large part of it formed in early life, or at least the foundations of it are set in early life, and the shadow dynamic that you get into. But that also comprises of what are known as complexes, and they too tend to relate to archetypes. So it's not like there's the personal and then there's the collective, and they're just these two completely separate things. Again, this is just conceptual. There's a great deal of difference between the two, but the lines between them also might not be that clearly demarcated either, because certainly there's aspects of the personal unconscious that also have an archetypal flavor. So the ego has to relate, of course, to both of these. And even though there is an archetypal flavor to aspects of the personal unconscious, and there's certainly ways in which the complexes that form there and the shadow material that forms there, all of this has archetypal relevance. But the aim with the personal unconscious is largely to, yes, integrate those aspects of it that create tension with our conscious stance, and also deepen a relationship with it in general, understand it, and release our fear of it. And in the case of the collective unconscious, that's even more true. The collective unconscious is inordinately larger, but you can certainly integrate elements of the archetypes as they pertain to you. So your relationship to the anima or the animus, your relationship to the shadow, your relationship to the mother archetype, and so on. You can do the personal work on these archetypes, but there'll always be a need to respect their autonomy, recognize them as psychically real and as having a independent existence rendered by your mind, yes, but not belonging to you. And this is that deepening a relationship aspect that we keep coming back to. So the process of developing self-knowledge requires both of those things, because it's one thing to come to terms with a bit of tension in your own mind, but if you're not also at the same time coming to understand the very nature of your mind and the mind in general, including the unconscious mind, we're not going anywhere sustainably. It's necessary that we come to understand the nature of the unconscious mind itself. We don't have to get super technical. We don't have to get super even detailed about it. I mean, I like to understand it as precisely as I can, and I enjoy that and I like sharing it. But at the base level, it's largely about this relationship to mystery and taking a healthy attitude towards the unknown. It's not there to harm you. It's not trying to harm you. Sometimes it might have to, but it's a perfectly natural consequence to whatever the conscious stance may be at that time. And again, this isn't to say that you cause everything you experience, because you're not the only person with free will here, of course. Even within that, there's space for that fact within what we're talking about here, because that itself presents an unknown factor. That itself presents an unquantifiable risk. Right? How do you know you're not going to be burgled or something? These are all facts of life that we have to mitigate, understand, and come to terms with on some level. So I think it's a good idea that we talk about the shadow soon. In fact, I'm actually working on a course, 2 courses on shadow work, inner shadow work and outer shadow work. So we're going to be talking more about that in future episodes for sure. For now, I'll just take a moment just to remind you that the Know Yourself program is live. The first course in the series, of which there's going to be 5 courses, the first course is called the Make It Conscious Philosophy. And in that, I go deeper into the philosophical foundations of what we're talking about here: self-awareness, depth psychology, and drawing on ancient wisdom as well. It's really aiming to equip you to develop some of your own answers to the big questions. My job here is not to answer those questions. It's not to eliminate mystery, but it's to ground you in the tools that I found helpful for navigating those realities. And it also talks about what Make It Conscious is about and why I'm doing what I'm doing here. So that's only $7, so feel free to check that out. Course 2 is the Active Imagination course, How to Talk to Yourself. This one's way more practical, and this is the Jungian practice of engaging with the unconscious mind and developing that relationship with it. So very important practice. Beyond that, there's going to be the next 2 courses, Inner Shadow Work and Outer Shadow Work. I've called them this because inner shadow work is coming to terms with that which is difficult to confront in ourselves. And of course, nothing in shadow work is one-sided. So there's also the course on outer shadow work, which is comes to terms with that which is difficult to assimilate in the world. And there's no such thing as inner without outer or outer without inner. So both courses actually span both themes to some extent, but I've also delineated them out because there's certain tools and philosophies and techniques that tend to emphasize one side of that over the other. They'll be coming pretty soon. I hope to get those up in just, well, a matter of 2 or 3 weeks from now, probably. And course 5 will be the way of individuation. In that course, I'll be going into the 7 habits model, all the way from responsibility to intention to communication, all the way up to concentration, meditation, divination, active imagination, etc. So with that said, I will thank you for your time and attention, whether you are watching this on YouTube or whether you're listening to the Make It Conscious podcast. Either way, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in a future episode.